And first, I would like to introduce Sarah. Sarah Elizabeth Dill, JD LLM FRSA, is a partner at Anithan Global in Washington, D.C., and the MENA GCC region, and serves as the International Bar Association's Arab Region Liaison Officer for War Crimes. As I mentioned earlier, she's also a proud fellow of the RSA. So, Sarah, would you please take it away?
Thank you, Diggs, for that introduction. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to all of you from all over the world. We're so happy that you've all joined us today. I think there are some others waiting to join. Just one last housekeeping. All of the panelists have agreed to forego long introductions to allow the most time for questions and dialogue. And we do truly hope that we have a very engaging process of question and answer. Each of us will speak for a few minutes and then we will open up for questions and answers, and Diggs will let you know what to do about that and all the logistics for the question and answer session. To dive in, COVID-19 created an environment where people were confined to their homes, depressed, frustrated, and spending more time on screens than ever before. Add to that the escalation of a multi-decade simmering conflict over unlawful occupation of territory into a war, and you have a scenario prime for the spread of hate. That's precisely what I encountered as a human rights lawyer focusing on war crimes when I became the target of a coordinated online campaign of hate, threats, and harassment. I spent months in the endless process of taking screenshots, reporting, blocking, notifying the police and FBI about credible threats, and then following up with Twitter and their lack of a legitimate response. Inundated with hundreds of tweets and messages per day, even entities and organizations I work with or volunteer for, or schools I attended, were targeted with harassment during this time. Fake client reviews were posted on multiple websites, bar complaints were regularly threatened. I received death threats on multiple occasions, my personal information was posted, my office even received threatening and harassing phone calls. Photos of me in hijab were posted with captions of terrorist and ISIS supporter. The abuse was also gender-focused, targeting my appearance or becoming hypersexualized with vile and pornographic comments. At one point, they even started making threats about my dog. She's a rescued German Shepherd, but unlike the Biden's dogs, she doesn't get Secret Service protection. I quickly learned the failings of Twitter's reporting mechanism and artificial intelligence review. Despite being a billion-dollar company, they failed to invest in meaningful programs to protect their users and enforce their own clearly stated policies and rules on online hate and abuse. Nor does their technology have the training and learning to discern the meaning and context of statements. For example, "I will kill you," or "I hope your children die so they don't have you as a mother," were removed as violations, whilst statements like "we will find you and take care of you," or "how's the coffee at," insert my office address, "maybe I'll stop by," didn't trigger a finding of a violation, even if they accompanied other threatening or harassing tweets. This process was exhausting, and all simply because I spoke out about the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Despite criticizing violations or human rights concerns as to both countries, it was when I tweeted specifically about the Armenian shelling of civilians and bombings that killed children and the desecration of mosques by turning them into pig barns that the hate speech and attacks surfaced. A disinformation campaign was launched against me, and even some famous lawyers and others with large followings would encourage and incite their followers to harass me in a sort of pile-on. Twitter never found a violation in this because the person did not specifically tweet, "Go harass this lawyer and send her abusive and threatening messages." I may have escaped the bombs and landmines, but clearly was targeted with psychological warfare. This process piqued my interest into how online hate plays such a strong role during times of war, in addition to what we see in our everyday life or what we've seen in the US with the racial tensions over the last years. Seeing firsthand how two sides would engage in a campaign of anger and hate against each other via an online platform because they weren't on the battlefield, and how it escalated tensions, and I felt truly prevented the sides from engaging in dialogue or finding ways to resolve their disputes. The failure of Twitter to enforce their own policies, I felt, allowed this to continue to escalate and would hamper the post-conflict reconciliation process. When voices are bullied into silence, and when experts refrain from speaking out or providing suggestions for solutions out of fear of reprisals, the ability to craft a truthful narrative dissipates, and strategies for success are left in people's minds, not put into action. Nor are we allowed to hear what grievances people have or what issues require discussion and resolution. Disinformation is also frequently paired with hate speech and is an extremely dangerous phenomenon, especially when it occurs during war. The ease with which a person can alter photographs or create videos can cause a lie to go viral in minutes. These instances further work against peace, especially if they involve false allegations of torture or war crimes. As false narratives become like gospel to those who want to believe and perpetuate them, or when reputable organizations dispel those myths and do not report on the fakes, the organizations are then subjected to campaigns of harassment and hate. This also can prolong the accountability and justice process, as investigators and prosecutors have to sort through fakes to find the legitimate cases to pursue for prosecution. We saw this directly when, after I had called on prosecutions for war crimes, Azerbaijan announced prosecutions of some of its own soldiers for war crimes they had committed, but also indicated that many of the videos were found to be fakes. I was not the only one targeted during this time. I observed hate, threats, and harassment widespread. Journalists, human rights lawyers, organizations such as Amnesty International are targets of hate and harassment even until this morning. So I began to think about what solutions could exist, whether simple fixes can stop the hemorrhaging of hate that occurs online. And the first thing that I focused on is what happens to the reported content. LinkedIn actually hides the content until it finishes a review, and then the content is deleted if a violation is found. If not, it's reinstated. Twitter, on the other hand, leaves up all reported content, even if it contains private personal information, such as a home address or other harmful dissemination, allowing the content to go viral and spiral out of possible containment. So I call on social media platforms to implement a policy whereby upon a report of violations, the content would be temporarily hidden until a review could be conducted. The person issuing the complaint should have greater opportunity to provide a narrative and place the burden on the author of the hateful or offending content to explain why their tweet or post does not violate the rules. The victim would then have the opportunity to respond. I suspect that few people would attempt to defend their hateful and criminal conduct in most circumstances, but also that the resources required to engage in more human review of these situations are certainly feasible for large social media platforms. But the reporting process also needs major reforms. 2 days ago, the Wilson Center released an incredible report on online hate and violence against women. I'll post the link in the chat and highly recommend reading it. But one of their recommendations is to allow for what they called incident reporting. And instead of focusing on one tweet or one particular account, a user could file a narrative report indicating multiple accounts, tweets, or posts, and describing the existence of a coordinated campaign of hate and harassment, so that the platforms would be given the entire picture of what was occurring and being able to better decide whether what was being said, taken as a whole, violated their policies. The platforms also need to invest in greater outreach and training to understand cultural, religious, and ethnic contexts. This is especially true in situations involving war and in situations around the globe. We can end hate in our society. We can minimize its effects on populations, but we all have to work together on this. And that is why I'm so grateful for everyone who has joined us today, people who have been working on this issue for years, and will share with us their expertise and guidance. So with that, knowing much is left for further discussion, I'm going to turn the stage over to our next speaker. Arjun Sethi is a professor at Georgetown Law School and a prominent activist. He is also the author of an incredible book, American Hate, Survivors Speak Out. Arjun, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this conversation. I want to start by just acknowledging that this is obviously a very difficult moment across the world. And so I hope all of you are taking care. Again, grateful that you're part of this conversation today. As Sarah mentioned, a lot of my work in this space has been with survivors, people who have been directly and viciously targeted on social media platforms on account of who they are and what they believe. And so in 2017, I actually traveled the United States and met with people, literally people who were targeted by different forms of hate in connection with the election in the United States. And so I just want to share a few observations that I have on this issue that in so many ways is informed by my work with them. First, is that survivors themselves, so people who've actually been on the receiving end of misinformation, of trolling, of doxing, hate, often don't have a seat at the table. And I think that's just really important, right? And so when we're talking about the right policy, when we're talking about what that right balance is, let's make sure that we actually have survivors like Sarah, who just shared her harrowing story, be part of the conversation. And I met survivors who felt like they were being excluded, and that's why I share that. Two, that hate can also cause people to leave the platforms. And that's also very important, right? It's important generally because in so many ways, different social media channels have become an indispensable form of organizing, communicating, but also because if you are an insular or discrete community, in some cases, you rely on social media more so than others. And so, for example, in the disabled community in the United States, because of issues they have with accessibility, they rely on social media in extraordinarily profound ways. And yet they are often on the end of vicious trolling, vicious hate, and sometimes that causes them to leave. The same is true for Muslims, the queer community, the trans community. And so again, also being mindful of who is directly impacted, who's acutely impacted, and who, because of that, is sometimes forced to leave the platform. The other thing that I learned is that hate can actually lead to PTSD. And so let me tell you about two survivors that I met and their experiences. So here I am in Washington, D.C., speaking to you from my apartment in Washington, D.C. And so one of the people I met is Taylor Dumpson. Taylor Dumpson is the first Black woman to ever be elected student body president at American University. The day that Taylor takes office at American University in Washington, D.C., April 1st, 2017, nooses were found hanging across the campus of American University, and she was simultaneously viciously cyber trolled online. So folks mocked her race, her gender, they photoshopped her face, doxed all her social media handles and the like. And so Taylor's actually now become an outspoken advocate on issues of mental health and how hate can actually cause online, in some cases, what may be considered lawful, actually cause PTSD and the like. Another person I met is by the name of Tanya Gersh, a Jewish American realtor who's actually based in Whitefish, Montana. And she talked about how her family, entire family, her two kids and husband, were viciously trolled by white supremacists. They published her two young children's social media profiles. They started making jokes about the Holocaust. And she started talking to me, and I recount this story about how she had to have a conversation with her 10-year-old about the Holocaust and about that mass murder event. It got so bad that folks actually organized a white supremacist march that was set to culminate at her house. And so Tanya too actually talked about how she too suffers from PTSD. And so what does that look like? It literally means that if Tanya sees somebody walking in the corner, she recoils because she thinks it could be one of the people who targeted her online, right? She doesn't trust strangers. She had to change her phone number. So there are very real life consequences to actually people being trolled. And related to that, one of the other issues that I wanted to raise, and I think is also sometimes frustrating about conversations about free speech and hate speech and the like, is that they are almost always dominated by lawyers. And so I will tell you, I think lawyers should have a seat at the table, but so should survivors, so should mental health professionals, so should media scholars who can actually speak to viral media, fake news, and the intersection among them. And, I'll sort of make two last points, piggybacking off that point I just made. One of the arguments that a lot of people like to make, and I encounter this a lot online and otherwise, is that the answer to hate speech is more free speech. And so even if you believe that, even if you could have made that argument, let's just say some years ago, one has to ask, does that actually work in the year 2021? In the digital age, in the age of fake news and viral media? Because we've literally seen across the world, social media, fake news, and hate be used and mobilized to lead to pogroms in India, genocide in Myanmar. And so by the time people have the chance to actually write the record, right, and to counteract that free speech that is perhaps dangerous but lawful according to some, people have already lost their lives. The consequences have already occurred. And then finally, I want to also say that when speaking about this, whatever curbs we do impose on the social media platforms and the like, we have to do so, I believe, in a transparent way. And so there should be notice. There should be an iterative process between users, policymakers, and these platforms. We should have some sense as to why they're banning people, as to how many people they're banning, and the like. And so I am all for having a robust conversation and making sure we're protecting survivors, making sure that we're including survivors, making sure that those who are most impacted by hate continue to remain on the platforms, that it's a healthy, viable place for expression, while simultaneously making sure that we do have some mechanisms in place so that we have some sense as to what these platforms are actually doing and how they're regulating folks online.
Wonderful. Thank you, Arjun, so much, and for sharing those snippets from your book and highlighting a number of the legal issues that we do grapple with when weighing free speech versus protecting people from online hate, which, as we've seen, can lead to direct in-person violence against individuals. I'd now like to turn to Abed Ayoub, the National Legal and Policy Director for the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee here in Washington, D.C. And Abed, if you could speak to us about what ADC, and I know you're heavily involved in a number of communities and coalitions, what they've been doing over the last years to counter online hate, promote reforms, providing assistance to targets of hate campaigns, and what you see as your efforts moving forward.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for creating this space and opportunity. This is a very important issue. So what I'm going to do is take us back a few years so we get an understanding of where organizations such as ADC, where we began on this work. The events of January 6th here in the United States and what happened in the U.S. Capitol, it really thrust into the mainstream the ugly underbelly of social media. I mean, for the first time, we were discussing how hate has found a home on social media platforms, but it's in how they're organized on social media. But this did not start in 2016. This didn't start with the elections in 2016 or over the past 4 years. It's been a problem going back, at least the last decade. At ADC, we began seeing this ugly side of social media around 2009, 2010, with the Ground Zero Mosque in New York City. For years, Islamophobes were those with anti-Arab sentiment and overall just racist and bigots. They were marginalized on the sidelines with very little space and methods to operate. But with social media, they were given a platform, and their message was spread to millions. That's when we began seeing disinformation, fake news, hate, bigotry, and division. And in about 2009-10, because of social media, including Facebook and Twitter, millions of Americans believed that Muslims were building a mosque at the Ground Zero site of World Trade Center, at the World Trade Center. So the organizing of that Ground Zero mosque that year in 2010 and the protests around that mosque, it was possible because of social media, and that continued. This in turn fueled more Islamophobes, more anti-Arab sentiment. And not too long after the rally, we began seeing an increase in online harassment of our community members, as well as physical hate crimes and incidents of our community members. In the years following that Ground Zero mosque and the increase of hate crimes in these platforms, more perpetrators began getting radicalized and falling into this trap that we see them in now. And it provided an opportunity for them. And sadly, it also provided an opportunity for them to easily target victims. And, I was taking notes, victims like Taylor and Tanya, who Arjun just talked about. I mean, they organize around social media to target these two women. And that's the way it was used. And this same movement, it provided an opportunity for a washed up reality TV star to have a platform to say the president of the United States wasn't born in the US. The birther movement, it happened because of social media. And it was at this point, many organizations, many advocates such as ADC knew there's something wrong here. Something needs to be done. We cannot allow for this type of misinformation, this type of bigotry against our communities, Black, Brown, Arab, Muslim communities, South Asian communities, to go unanswered. And for years, we tried to get in touch and communicate with social media platforms and, their headquarters here in DC, and advocates such as Arjun and others were around the table. We would push and write and try to get the issues out there, but nothing, things were done, mechanisms were put in place, but obviously they can be improved. Even going back to 2017, I was going through our notes, we raised alarms about the QAnon movement and how this is a dangerous movement where white supremacists are, flocking to this movement. You have groups like the Proud Boys that are openly on social media pushing this movement. But, unfortunately, it seemed that because the focus wasn't on white supremacy at the time or whatever reasons, social media companies just did not take it seriously. And there were attempts to, stymie their activity, but it was not successful. And also, unfortunately, what we began seeing is, voices of Arabs and Muslims and other brown and Black communities also being marginalized, where, as Sarah mentioned earlier, there was not a clear mechanism or guidelines as to what exactly is hate speech, what exactly can be taken down, or who exactly can be kicked off the platform. All of a sudden, we began seeing, for example, pro-Palestinian activists, having their accounts taken down for something that, is nowhere near remote, nearly hate speech, and same with members of the BLM movement. So there was confusion about, how these rules are enforced, what are the rules, and, how we can stop hate from spreading. But look, I'll close by saying this. I mean, social media companies do have a moral responsibility and duty to address this issue, but at the same time, I'm not naive. There is no easy answer. We all want the free exchange of ideas and speech, but there needs to be a line. There needs to be a balance in addressing hate speech and ensuring that our communities are not targeted and our communities are not, victims of these hate crimes. And we also need to understand the enormity and complexity of this problem. And I like, Arjun, how you laid down the PTSD, the impact it has on the victims. And these layers need to be discussed by, with social media companies. And we need to think of ways to have, civil society and social media companies, working together closer, coming up with fresh new ideas, coming up with new ways we can address this issue. Because again, it is a new age issue. It's something we haven't dealt with before at this size and this magnitude. And hopefully, we can keep these conversations going and come up with ways that we can push our, collective agendas forward. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Abed, and for really outlining the historical context as much as we've been fighting with this and what we need to do moving forward. Now that we've heard from what has been happening and the recognition that this isn't a simple problem, we're now going to turn to Thomas Hughes, someone who's had a career in human rights and is now the director of the Oversight Board Administration, an entity set up by Facebook as part of their content removal and appeals process. Thomas has graciously joined us from the UK today to share insights and counter some of the disinformation about what Facebook and the Oversight Board are doing. And thank you, Thomas. So I'll turn it over to you now.
Sarah, thank you very much. And thank you very much to the RSA for the invitation to join this panel today. Let me start by noting that the presentations by you, Sarah, Arjun, Abed, and I'm sure Molly as well, but have been already very thought-provoking, and I am very much looking forward to the open discussion session that we will have after these presentations. I think, as many of you will be aware, the Oversight Board is a new body comprised of independent members from around the world who will make, or do already make, binding decisions on what content Facebook and Instagram should allow or remove, and those decisions are based on the respect for freedom of expression and human rights. As such, the board was designed as an independent check on Facebook's approach to content moderation, with the goal of empowering users globally through a more transparent process and for them to be able to appeal the content decisions. The board will, of course, address some of the most significant content moderation decisions. And as you will have seen from the first cases that the board has been assigned, these already range from hate speech and incitement through to dangerous individuals and organizations and adult nudity. The board members, they come from different backgrounds, countries and cultures, and they have different opinions and beliefs. They may not, and certainly do not, agree with each other necessarily on all issues, but all of them do share a commitment to freedom of expression and human rights. And I would also note that the board is about deliberation and not advocacy. Its relevance and its impacts will be on the cases it hears and the quality of those decisions. So as the director of the Oversight Board Administration, my role is to lead a team of professional staff that support the board members as they go through that process of selecting, reviewing, deliberating and publishing cases. I would like to note that, of course, I'm not a Facebook employee and I do not answer to the company. In that regard, the reputational and commercial interests of Facebook play no role in my work, and they certainly play no role in the work of the board either. Now, let me say a few words also about how the board operates and how far we've come since we launched at the start or in the first quarter of last year. So currently, Facebook users are able to appeal to the board in cases where Facebook has removed their content. In the months to come, we will add the opportunity to review appeals from users who want Facebook to remove content, as well as to appeal the suspension of accounts. The board can also review content that is referred by Facebook as opposed to appealed by users. And this can include many significant types of decisions and also different types of content, not only from Facebook and Instagram, but it can also include advertising or groups. However, the board does not have the authority to review some types of content. So things that are excluded at the moment are content that is not on either Facebook or Instagram, or decisions that relate to intellectual property or competition, or any issues that carry a legal obligation vis-a-vis Facebook. Now, while the board is not going to be able to hear every single case it receives, it is prioritizing cases that impact the greatest number of users, that the board thinks are of critical importance to public discourse, and also raise important questions about Facebook's community standards and policies and how they apply them. As the board reviews cases, members decide whether the content involved violated Facebook's community standards and values. They also consider whether Facebook's removal of the content respected international human rights standards and norms, wherein freedom of expression has a central role, but I would stress so does or do the principles of equality and non-discrimination. Moreover, the board is seeking to apply in those international human rights standards, not only in its decisions, but also in its procedures. And as such, it's developed its approaches to be consistent with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and especially for those of you who are familiar with those principles, Principle 31 on non-judicial grievance mechanisms. And they essentially outline a number of criteria, of which transparency, predictability, engagement of users, and so on are amongst them. Also, to ensure that decisions are well informed, the board's review process also includes contextual research and public comments from third parties. And this allows input to the board so that they can tap into a greater array of knowledge and expertise and context about particular cases, because obviously these cases come from a very wide variety of geographies and cover a wide variety of issues. Importantly, the board's decision-making is binding on Facebook. The company will be required to reinstate or leave up, or take down, content based on these decisions. And the board will also make policy recommendations to Facebook, which I should note at this stage are recommendations, so those are not binding. But Facebook will have to respond both to its decisions, which are binding, and also to the recommendations publicly. Moreover, by publishing decisions and the rationale behind them, the board is seeking to open up its decision-making and be subject essentially to scrutiny from the outside world, including from a human rights lens. So tomorrow, we'll be publishing the board's first case decisions. And although I can't preemptively comment on what those decisions entail, I am still, or nevertheless, very confident that the board has approached these decisions with the rigor and care that the cases deserve. And Sarah, with that, I'll pass back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Thomas. And that was certainly an insightful and educating discussion of what the Oversight Board is doing. And we're thrilled that you allowed us to record this and post it online so that others can see the video and learn about what is actually going on, as that will guide other efforts, I'm sure, as we continue to work together. And last but certainly not least, we're going to turn to Molly Land, a professor of law and human rights at the University of Connecticut School of Law. Molly is also the co-author of a recent report and recommendations through the American Bar Association on online hates and threats to human rights defenders, and will share some of their findings and recommendations with us today. So Molly.
So thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for being here, and to RSA for organizing this discussion. So I've been looking at the intersection of human rights and technology for many years, and recently, well, not so recently anymore, now in 2018, 2019, the American Bar Association came to myself and a colleague of mine, Richard Wilson, with a question and a request. The American Bar Association's Human Rights Center works with human rights defenders around the world. And these are individuals who regularly face issues of criminalization, imprisonment, and violence. And the Human Rights Center said to us, the one thing that they heard back from defenders that the defenders were most worried about was Facebook. Right, in light of all of the other things that they were facing, their single greatest worry in many, many instances was Facebook. And the Human Rights Center, we said, we need to find out more about this. We need to understand what's going on. And so my colleague and I, together with a group of students at the University of Connecticut, did a pilot study in Guatemala to look at how social media platforms were being mobilized by state and state-aligned actors to target those in the country who were working on behalf of accountability for past crimes and working to address impunity, including for things like corruption. We published a report that Sarah mentioned, and now have expanded our research to also look at this phenomenon in Colombia, Nigeria, and Serbia. And what we've found is consistent with everything that's been said, which is that platforms are being used to deploy coordinated campaigns of online threats and harassment of human rights defenders in order to silence civil society, in order to suppress dissent. Researchers who are working on this are calling this phenomenon digital authoritarianism. It's sort of state authoritarianism 2.0. And our research is trying to document this through a series of methods as a new form of state repression, and to consider how platforms can better respond to the needs of human rights defenders, journalists, and activists around the world. So we have a number of recommendations, but you know, and our research is ongoing. But I wanted to highlight here two things that have already been touched on, but I wanted to expand them in the context of what we're seeing globally. The first is that we argue that the companies need to develop mechanisms for considering the real world context in which the speech occurs. And I was very encouraged by what Thomas just said about the Facebook Oversight Board. I think that context is essential, but it needs to be deployed at every level of review. Companies, the platforms largely use one-size-fits-all policies that govern content on their platforms regardless of the local context in which the speech is being deployed. Certainly on an individual basis, there's, you know, as posts move their way up in the hierarchy of review, there's greater human review, there's greater consideration of context. But first and foremost, there's one set of rules to bind us all. And the risk of speech varies widely based on the context in which it occurs. And so that means, to our view, that platforms are both missing a lot of content that's very dangerous, and also overbroad, regulating and over-censoring in some contexts where speech is actually not dangerous. So an example of what might be missed from Guatemala and from our report is the use of the term white van. And Sarah, this is very similar to what you said about threats. You know, if you say, I will kill you, that's certainly going to be a threat that would violate community standards and be taken down. But more euphemistic language, more contextual language is often missed. And so in Guatemala, the trolls would post references to the white van. The white van is in your neighborhood, right? Or the white van is going to come for you. And sometimes even when the white van might get triggered or flagged, they would say the ice cream truck, right? Because they're typically white. And this on its face could seem innocent, and certainly in terms of the words that are used doesn't violate Facebook's community standards. But in the context of Guatemala, it's a reference, a very clear reference to the security forces that drive around and surveil and target human rights defenders. So again, without that local context, someone who's reviewing this material is not going to see the threat. And that's even if it's flagged, even if it makes it to review, it's not going to be viewed as the threat that it very clearly is based on this local context. The other problem, and this has also been raised, but I want to emphasize it, is that this content-based approach, which just looks at the words that are used, doesn't take into account the problem of amplification. Right, the fact that these are coordinated campaigns, that's not just one slur, not just one threat, but there's a volume there that is just overwhelming and impossible for the person who's being targeted to deal with. So there's a cumulative effect of this harassment that's addressed in some of the platform policies. For example, spam, you know, some of it might get considered to be spam, but there's not really good channels to explain that this is not just one piece, but part of a coordinated campaign. And this is the second problem that we've been really trying to work on. So we're both trying to document these needs and also advocate with human rights defenders, with companies to try to respond to some of these needs. The second problem is that there are no communication channels for defenders and activists who feel that they're under threat. The first line that companies will say is the defender should flag the content. But that's really inadequate for all of the reasons we've heard. You just can't track down all the content. It would be a full-time job. And in addition, there's the PTSD that Arjun was talking about, that having to view and flag each piece of content is a harm extracted from the defender, from the person who's being targeted. So I think it's really unfair to put the burden on the person who's being harassed to notify a company of each and every instance. And in some instances, people aren't even on the platform. The ones who are being targeted are offline, and they have no way of actually flagging the content. So activists who want protection, who are in need of protection, don't have a way to contact the companies unless they know someone, or they know someone who knows someone who can get them in touch with someone at Facebook, at Twitter, you know, at YouTube, who can then help them with this content. And I've gotten those requests when I'm talking to defenders. They're like, I don't know what to do. And I know people at the companies, so I've tried to, and I know others who have also tried to be those channels, but that is simply an ineffective way. It is ad hoc and arbitrary for trying to figure out how to deal with these human rights harms.
Molly, if you could just wrap up so we can get to the Q&A. Thank you.
That actually was where I was going to leave it. My next sentence was, I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Wonderful. Thank you, Molly, for all of that. And I think it really encapsulates so many things that have come into light about the effect of this. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Robert Diggs, who's going to give a few housekeeping matters as we enter the Q&A session, and allow him to explain to all of you the mechanism for asking questions, which we highly encourage. We want this to be a dialogue. We're curious to hear what follow-ups you have on what's been discussed today. So Diggs, please go ahead.
Yes, so just as you saw in the chat, I was saying that you should be free to feel free to raise your hand to unmute yourself to speak if you're joining us on Zoom, that is. So you will find that option under participants and raise more, and then raise your hand, and we will allow you to unmute yourself to join the conversation. But for now, I know that Sarah had one question that she wanted to ask the panelists, and then we will, I see there are two already that are ready and willing to speak. But first I will let Sarah ask the question that she had for the panelists. So please, Sarah, go ahead. I
am actually happy to turn it right over to Q&A from the audience. Give them an opportunity to reach out. So please feel free. Sounds good. So the first person I see here is Tim from St. Albans. Please go ahead and ask your question. Oh, I'm sorry. I need to let you speak. So please go ahead and click the button there that allows you to unmute.
Great. Thank you for setting out the situation very clearly and helpfully. A short question, really. What gives you the greatest sense of hope? Did you get that? In this situation, what gives you the greatest sense of hope as you consider social media and hate speech? What gives you hope?
Panelists? Want to jump in on that?
Just a couple of thoughts. The story of Taylor Dumpson that I shared. Taylor is now a very outspoken advocate on these issues. She is training to be a civil rights lawyer. And so she's actually used her experience to become a real advocate on PTSD and sort of the mental health implications and consequences of hate. The other point I'd like to make is I think we're making progress. And so one of the things that's so hard about this moment is that there are so many currents and so many inputs happening all at once. Right. And I think if you think about how young the internet is and you think about how young these social media channels are, there's going to be tripwires, there's going to be mistakes. But I think the fact that we are having this conversation, the fact that there's an iterative process, the fact that survivors are increasingly being roped in, the fact that, public health professionals and community organizations like ADC, where Abed works, are being used and organized, and we have terminology like digital authoritarianism, which as someone in the comments says is amazing. I agree. That's encouraging. That's inspiring work.
Any other reflections?
I mean, I'll just add, look, it follow up on what Arjun says, we are making progress. And it's important to keep in mind, at least for us, social media has been a great tool. I mean, there is there's this component we're talking about with the, with the hate crimes and so forth. But overall, I think at least in the U.S., we're moving towards a point where, hate speech is not only going to be addressed in social media, but the programs that are happening offline. And I think there's going to be a lot more attention towards that. You're not going to fix, humanity and society, through a tweet or through a Facebook post. I think people are beginning to understand that the answer is not going to come from a corporation or from some guidelines Facebook puts in. There's a lot more work we need to do offline to get to that point. And I do see a lot of policies, a lot of organizations, a lot of professionals, finally realizing that, we do need to go into that direction. And I'm optimistic that, within a few years, we'll see the impact of that.
If I could just jump in. Oh, yeah, if I could just jump in as well and just say that one thing that encourages me is that there are so many people working on this problem. And in terms of the research side, we really have an opportunity, in part because all of this is, all of our speech is digital. And, we can try to hone in on a better understanding of what speech is most risky, what speech is most harmful. I think, incitement and propaganda have been around forever, and we've largely, in terms of the law, relied on anecdote and intuition to try to distinguish between what's incitement and what's not. And there's a lot of people who are working now in academia and in practice to try to figure out how to build tools actually using artificial intelligence, which I'm usually very skeptical about, but it offers a lot of possibilities to try to think about drawing patterns out of the data that we have, the immense data that we have, to figure out what is really risky so that we can not take down everything, right? That's also not a good option, but take down this stuff and figure out strategies that are actually more effective to tailored remedies.
And if I could add as well, just to reflect and really reinforce the comments that have already been made, I think there is an enormous growing awareness of the issues that are at stake. And I think 2021 may well be the year in which, different solutions, of which the Oversight Board is one, but different solutions are tested and put into effect. And we see this across the board, across all countries, different innovations, different demands. And as I say, I think over the coming months, we will see these work. We will see these being operationalized.
Thank you. Let me get to one more question in the queue, and then we can come back to the written questions that are coming in. So, Emily, you've been granted access to unmute yourself, and I will let you join the panel to ask your question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for hosting this. So my question is, well, I guess I have a comment and a question. So it seems like social media companies have this role of kind of being the keeper of justice and ethics. And so I'm curious, is that true? With how the law works, is it is that true, or is the law helping to guide Twitter and Facebook, etc.? And then a second question, what can we do as individuals to, help? Is there anything in particular, ways we can help other people or organizations that are already working on this issue? I'm a mom of 2 toddlers, and I'm just thinking about the future in this digital age and everything. So yeah, I would love to know about that. Popcorn Molly. Just kidding, whoever would like to share.
I was going to actually ask, I can take a stab at the law piece. I am a lawyer, but I work with a lot of non-lawyers. I know there was a comment, I think it was Arjun later, who said that we needed to have an interdisciplinary discussion. I think also psychologists and cognitive scientists need to be involved in this discussion, because they're the ones that can help us understand the way in which the platforms are constructed, how they affect our brain, frankly. They're not, I don't know, this is a bit of a tangent, but I just want to say, I often ask my students, if you had to design a platform to promote dialogue, would it look like Facebook? Right? But anyway, about how the law works and whether companies are the keepers of justice and ethics, it's a great question. These are companies that operate across borders, and there's been sort of a growing consensus pushed forward by David Kaye, who's the former UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and opinion, to say that the law and norms that should govern the companies is human rights law, right? They're also required to comply with national jurisdictions, and there are jurisdictions all over the world that are seeking to regulate social media companies, which is another discussion. Yes, so they have to comply with national legislation, but David Kaye and others have really argued that they should also be thinking about compliance with international human rights law. And so that's where these norms and standards come from. Whether they're directly bound by those, international treaties is, it's a complicated. They're largely not bound directly. They're not states, but there's a lot of reasons for them to comply with human rights norms. And so, and many of them are taking up that as the standard, rather than creating sort of things out of nothing, right? There are standards that we can apply. And so they've been using human rights standards to try to make these distinctions. And again, I'm encouraged by what Thomas is saying about the incorporation of human rights standards into the Oversight Board.
And if I can follow up on that, as you pointed out, Molly, I mean, the Oversight Board itself is an exercise in the application of those standards. Again, in terms of what kind of body or how the ethics should be defined that are applied, with my background as working in civil society and freedom of expression and human rights defense, I shudder at the idea of direct government regulation around expression online, because of the implication and the what Molly has outlined previously. But at the same time, this obviously is not something that can simply sit in the hands of corporations, particularly corporations which tend to sit in the global north and or just in the United States. It needs to be multi-stakeholder. It needs to have many different perspectives included in it, as has been outlined by other speakers. Again, the oversight board is diverse in its composition and will become even more diverse as it moves from 20 to 40 members. But there needs to be multiple examples of this, and only by bringing and having a genuinely independent and multi-stakeholder process will you get that kind of input that is required.
So I want to make sure we get to more questions. One more question from the queue on video here. Lucinda, I will allow you to unmute yourself and ask your question, then we will go to written questions. Lucinda?
Yeah, so one of the things I've been doing a lot of research around online hate recently for various projects. And one of the things I've been reading about is kind of the hate content and trolling content is like between 2 and 6 more likely to get shared on social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook, which obviously generates a profit for these platforms. And obviously what we're talking about is quite a moral issue, and there's almost like a conflict of interest by reining in hate speech. It negatively impacts kind of revenue. So I guess my question is, like, what do we do to ensure that the platforms not only make these pledges, but kind of stick to them when it's not always financially in their best interest?
Before I answer this question, I should make very clear, I'm not a representative of Facebook.
Yeah, no,
I do not speak on behalf of Facebook.
Yeah, I know.
But I would say, hold to the best of your ability, hold the companies to their word. I mean, be active and be vocal. And if you feel that they are not doing so, absolutely make your case as strongly as you can.
There needs to be, accountability, and there are a lot of organizations that do meet with these companies and a lot of efforts out there. And I think, supporting them and getting engaged in those efforts, so these, groups that are around the table have a stronger voice when they are having these conversations, I think is very important.
So one question that was, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Molly.
I didn't know if Arjun wanted to jump in on that question, but I had just one little, I'd love to also talk about the commercial interest question, Sarah and Diggs, if that's okay. I want to share, it was a story told on a panel on this very topic yesterday by Tom Malinowski, who's a congressman from New Jersey, but he was talking about a study that that Facebook did, where they had their users rate content in terms of whether it was good for the world or bad for the world. So they were training their algorithm to learn the difference between broadly what their users thought as sort of good content and bad content. And then they implemented that algorithm on those same users, again, with their consent, this time at least. And the users spent less time on the platform when they were shown content that they themselves believed was better for the world than the content that was worse for the world. So there is a tension between, our desire to have these function as platforms for global dialogue and speech and activism, and the commercial interests of the platforms that want to engage their users and draw eyeballs. And this is not a new problem, right? When we think about oil companies, there's also going to be a tension between our environmental objectives and their commercial interests. So we have to grapple with questions like, how do they design their platform? How do they design their algorithm? How can we be transparent about the choices that they're making for us? And I guess to get back to, I think it was Emily's earlier question about what can we do, I'd echo what Abed just said about holding them accountable and pushing for things like more information about why are you showing me this content, right? And education about the fact that they are making choices for us in that regard.
So that actually dovetails into a question that I received directly about what is the role that social media companies have, or perhaps the responsibility they have to ensure that actual genuine information is getting through to folks. And I'll combine that with another question that came in the general question. Is there a way that can help break down the silos that sort of help create these echo chambers that can sometimes lead to the hate that some of you have experienced that you detailed today?
I'll jump in initially on that because I believe it was in the last couple of days, Twitter announced a program called Birdwatch, where they were going to use individuals in the public sphere to counter the disinformation that is so easily spread via social media platforms. Obviously, we welcome having a broader audience as possible weighing in on things, but my first reaction to that was, I think it's great that social media platforms are taking disinformation seriously and fake seriously and wanting to deal with them as quickly as possible before they go viral and become like a truth. But it's also concerning that, as Molly and Thomas just spoke to the commercial interests of them, given the amount of revenue that these entities are bringing in. This should be something that's their investment, that they are hiring people and that they are hiring a very diverse and global set of people to weigh in on this and to do the research as to what is a fake, what is not fake, what is genuine. Obviously, we have strong concerns about censorship. We can only think to, authoritarian regimes that do not want accurate stories told. So it's a very, very difficult problem to deal with. But I think that if they are going to have such a broad platform where information is shared so quickly, so widely, somebody with 3 million followers retweets something and instantly, we've seen reputable news companies sharing stories and then all of a sudden having to backtrack. And so I think that there is an ethical responsibility of these companies. If they are going to make millions and billions of dollars on their platforms, they need to ensure that they're, if they're the onion, they're the onion, and that's fine, and we know that. But if things are being presented, so I will just start with that, and then anyone else from the panel who wants to jump in on this or on the silos, please.
Abed, no, go ahead, Abed.
Look, the silos is real. I think that's a larger conversation. I think that's what's kind of leading into, at least in the U.S., a lot of the division that we're seeing. And this is something that really, again, it's been taken off since 2009, 10. It's gotten progressively worse through the years. I don't know how, on the tech side or on the algorithm sides, how that stuff works, but the silos is definitely a real threat. And I mean, I just know from personal experience, from experience at our organization, we're, a lot of these things that you see coming from the hate blogs, coming from the QAnon spaces, they're getting recycled by our membership and sent back to us in response to our emails. We have attorneys, we have professionals that were, involved with the organization that you think have an understanding of reality, who are now, sucked into this hole, repeating everything that they're reading, whether it be on, Ben Shapiro's websites or on Facebook or on this website, and it's just constantly recycling the same thing over and over. So I think that's the, a larger issue that we could talk about for hours, but we definitely need to find a way to break those silos down. And I think ultimately that will lead into a decrease of hate and rhetoric and a more, understanding between society and individuals.
I wanted to add something really quickly. Last night I taught my first class of the semester, and we were talking about restorative justice. And a student made a really interesting point and said, what does restorative justice in the context of a lot of sort of white supremacists and neo-fascists look like? Because their whole worldview is formed and shaped by these channels that are constantly mutually reinforcing, whether it's what they see on television, whether it's the social media channels and the like. And so I think it's an echo chamber. I think it's deeply entrenched. I think it has consequences for how we sort of see these platforms. I think it's has consequences in terms of criminal justice. One thing that somebody had suggested or I'd heard is that at some point Twitter was actually experimenting with a feature that could allow you to actually see what somebody else's Twitter feed looked like. So that you could actually, for a moment, have a window into what their echo chamber is. I wouldn't necessarily be interested in partaking in that, but there might be people who are interested, and it might be informative and educational for some to do that.
I love that idea, and I'll just add, I think, I don't know that we'll address the silo effect by having someone else choose what content we should get, right? That also seems like enormous power for a company or a government to have, right? I don't think we can force silos to come down, but I would like at the very least to have more awareness that there are silos, and to have people be able to make more choices. And it may mean that some people choose to go down that rabbit hole, and that is, we should talk about, right, what that would mean and how to address that, and whether there's sort of some limits to how far, but if you had more user choice so that you could have somebody, and I've often used this, and they've said, well, I'd love to have like a mix on my, feed, on my Facebook feed during the day of both left and right content. Sometimes I want to just understand like what the opposing views are. What does that information ecosystem look like? Almost like a series of gels in the theater that you put on your feed, and giving us the choice of doing that. And then just before bed, I just want puppies and kittens, it may mean that people say, I only want the content that, that I agree with, but at least they know they're making that choice, and that it isn't being fed to them automatically through an algorithm in a way that makes them feel like it's a natural affection of the world.
Great. And I know we've got about 10 minutes or so left. So for the next two people that Diggs has in the queue, if you could indicate who your question is directed at, and if we could have panelists kind of limit to 1 or 2 minutes so that we can get to as many questions as possible in our remaining time.
You read my mind, Sarah. And next is Sophie. So I will let you unmute yourself. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. My name is Sophie. I'm from Coventry Youth Activists, a group of people fighting for young disabled people's rights. And I have a question which I think would be best directed to Thomas Hughes. I'd like to ask, what can activists do to see the change and see the solutions that we've suggested? So, for example, having human review at every level of report. I get the impression that you're saying the answer doesn't lie with you or the oversight board, I think. You might be suggesting that that's from someone from Facebook, and if so, who is that, and what can we do to get to them?
Sophie, thank you. So there are two. So the board itself obviously decides on individual cases, but there are two avenues for engagement, and depending on the particular issue, you'll want to watch what cases are coming up. They're published on the website, and then engage in those that you think are most relevant. But as I say, there are two avenues. The first one is public comments. So whenever a case comes up, you can submit through a form online, submit public comments or your comments to that particular case, and include not only your impressions and thoughts around the decision on the case itself, so that would relate to whether content should remain up or down, but also recommendations that you would like to see the board make to Facebook. And then the board will follow up with Facebook and be monitoring and report publicly on the implementation of those. So that's the first avenue. The second avenue is that the board will later this year, well, in a couple of months from now, but later this year, roll out a series of policy development sort of framework opportunities. And essentially it will be looking as broadly as possible to engage different stakeholders around very specific issues, and to learn more about what kind of research is out there, what kind of feedback is required in order for them to formulate policy positions and then apply those to cases, as well as share them back. So I would strongly encourage you to use both of those avenues.
Thank you, Thomas. Next question is Wolfgang. Go ahead.
Hello. Wolf from London. I have a question for Thomas. So I'm working at a very relatively small social network based in London. And my question is, so from my experience, one of the hardest things to detect is manipulated media. Which especially because technology is getting better and better with this, and it's harder and harder. It's a race in technology to detect it. And I was wondering if you, Thomas, if you are aware of any effort to share findings between social media platforms. So for example, if Facebook or Twitter detects something or identifies something as manipulated media, that this could be shared between platforms as a kind of early warning system, so it's not going to spread. Because from my experience, if somebody produces something like this, they're going to post this on 10, 15 different platforms. And every platform right now has to go through their own process to identify it, to moderate it, and to deal with it. So yeah, my question is, are you aware of any effort or idea that this knowledge could be shared between platforms?
Wolfgang, thank you. There are a number of fora which are out there in the public sphere where different social media companies do cooperate and share information. But unfortunately, I'm not in a position to be able to speak to them in any detail. Again, I would just go back to the point that if you see individual cases, or there are individual cases where there is manipulated content, the benefit, I hope, of the board's approach is that it will dig deep into those cases. It will get context, as has been mentioned earlier, the importance of that, but it'll get context about those cases. It will work with vendors to understand how, if it's been manipulated, how that content was manipulated and what the viral impact of that manipulation may have been. So again, as I say, really going into the depths of cases and trying to choose cases which would then have an impact and ripple across other cases in future.
Thank you, Thomas. I want to jump back real quick to a question that came in early that I missed, and I want to apologize for that. It was to Sarah and Molly from a EU resident about how do these efforts square with our First Amendment rights here in the United States? What legislation is the sort of not catch-all, but what is the sort of cudgel being used to help fight this in light of our freedom of speech and how widely interpreted it is in this country?
Sarah, do you want to take the first stab?
I'll sacrifice myself on this one initially. Free speech is one of the most complex aspects that we deal with. And unfortunately, and I deal with this on a regular basis when people say, well, but free speech, I can say whatever I want. And it unfortunately is something that I think, and it goes back to, we need to fund education more than we fund other things in this country. But that's other platforms that we can discuss. That free speech is not unlimited. There are a number of very specific restrictions. I mean, you have, speech that incites violence or, danger to others. You have hate speech, you have pornography, you have a number of avenues that there are restrictions. But I think it's something that even our US Supreme Court has grappled with. It's something even around the globe that the EU wrestles with issues of free speech. You have the right to be forgotten. And I think that's also the problem that you have with these platforms, is that you're operating in a number of different environments of legislation, of laws, of restrictions. And, from the, in the war crimes perspective and the human rights world, we always think, what can we do to prevent the problem from occurring in the first place? What can we do to solve this before, as others said, before there's a dead body, before there's the hate, before there's the PTSD? And so I think that we have to go back almost to the roots, as a lot of, others have said on the panel, to educate people in terms of what is the proper way to dialogue, what is the proper way to debate ideas and understand that there may not be agreements. And so I think we do have to go back to the roots a little bit on this, but also in that fashion, educating people from a very young age as to what is and is not allowed in terms of speech, but also what is and is not appropriate. Just because you can do something does not necessarily mean that you always should.
I wholeheartedly agree with all of that. I would just add that with respect to the First Amendment in particular, it doesn't apply because these are private platforms. And in fact, a lot of the regulations that Facebook and Twitter have would be actually impermissible if they were governed by the First Amendment. So part of actually what enables them to act to address this hate speech, that a lot of it under the very robust terms of the US First Amendment would be protected. A lot of what enables them to act to address it is the fact that they're not governed by the First Amendment, that in fact we don't have a right. Now this is, that's the technical legal answer. I think there's a larger question about what we do with the fact that a lot of our, discourse in the public forum is happening in privately owned spaces, right? And we need to figure out how to grapple with the obligations that companies have to protect those on the platform. I think that there's a role, I call what Sarah was talking about, I call it responsible speech. I think we need to have freedom of speech, but we need to be thinking about its impacts on others. And how do governments and platforms really help us, and help us to do that, to be responsible in our speech? But it's a moving area because these are private platforms.
Thank you both. Very last question to Richard. Richard, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm curious, and I guess it's mostly directed to Thomas and Molly. And I'm curious whether anyone has seen the Foreign Affairs article by Francis Fukuyama that's proposing new filtering middleware as a solution to some of these problems. And the context is, we've got this question of censorship on one side, but the real problem, as people know, is the way amplification works and the way advertising models make that destructive. And the proposal is to return control of the feeds, which is the distribution, more to the users, and in particular to open it up and make an open market in feeds, so that you get back to a true marketplace of ideas, which has always worked to limit hate speech because of community pressure, and it just doesn't get amplified. And I left some links in the chat to those articles. So I'm curious, if you've seen them, and
so I'll try to
complementary.
I'll try to be really, really brief. I think that greater choice is fabulous. I haven't seen the article. I'll look it up. I'd also recommend an article on increasing user choice by having transferable social media profiles, so that we had more of a kind of a, we could have a social media platform, a profile, and we weren't limited to Facebook, right? So more user mobility. I think that would be key. But it is a work in progress. And I think that some of these questions that you're asking are terrific. Thomas?
Yeah, thank you. I will certainly, thank you for the link. I'll certainly read that article with interest. I would make the point that, well, if I understood correctly, how that will prevent content going viral, I didn't quite understand. But regardless, I think the solution that is required is multifaceted. And one aspect, I think, is a board which is independent, to which users can appeal, but it will require many other components as well. There is no one single fix. And I think, as I said at the start, I think during the course of this year and into next, we will see lots of different things being tried, and hopefully between them, the ecosystem will change.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Sarah, last words?
I'd just like to say thank you to everyone who joined us today for your fantastic questions. Apologies that we could not get to all of them, but certainly I know we have the chat, the ability to save it and address any of those if any of the panelists want to follow up. Huge thank you to the RSA for hosting our first event of the year, and I hope that all of you will join us for future events. And finally, to all of the wonderful panelists, all of you are heroes to me. You work so hard on so many important issues, and we're honored that you took the time to spend with us today and share your insights. And Diggs, don't yell at me, but I would recommend everyone do check out Arjun's book. It's excellent. The stories are very poignant, and I think helps kind of guide some of these discussions.
Absolutely. And just from my side, you will all get a email, or at least those of you watching who signed up through Eventbrite, you will get an email when this recording is available. It will include a link to Arjun's book and any other publications that our panelists have on offer. And with that, I wish you all a good rest of your afternoons, mornings, and evenings. Thank you all for being here.